revised it 6 times. This new edition of Archaeology, Theories, Methods, and Practice is the most comprehensive introduction to archaeological method and theory available. It is used by instructors and students for introductory courses on methods and theory, but also for classes on field methods, archaeological science, and a number of other courses. The book presents an up-to-date and accurate overview of the world of archaeology in the 21st century. We are acutely aware of the complex relationships between theory and method, and of both of these upon the current practice of archaeology in excavations, in museums, in heritage work, in the literature, and in the media. Throughout, the box features illustrate specific examples of excavation projects and explain particular techniques or theoretical approaches. The references and bibliography ensure that the work can be used as a gateway to the full range of current scholarship. In that way, it is also a work of reference for graduate students as well as professional archaeologists. We hope too that the book is written with sufficient clarity and purpose that it is of real value for the general reader, whether as an overview of the subject today or to be used selectively to follow up particular topics of interest. We have tried not to duck any of the controversial issues of contemporary archaeology, whether in the field of theory or of politics. And we have tried to include original ideas of our own. We would claim, for instance, that our chapter on the bioarchaeology of people offers an overview not readily found elsewhere, and that the chapters on cognitive archaeology and on explanation in archaeology offer syntheses that present a number of original perspectives. The discipline of archaeology is perpetually in a state of change, and we have tried to capture and to represent where it is at now. Resources. With this edition, students will have access to free online study materials at its quizzes, chapter summaries, flashcards, and web projects will enable students to test their comprehension of the book and to explore new areas of research. For instructors, there is an online instructor's manual, a test bank, and images and diagrams for use in class. Archaeology in the 21st century. We set out to convey a sense of the excitement of a rapidly moving discipline that is seeking answers to some of the fundamental questions about the history of humankind. The archaeological record is the only resource we have which can answer such questions about our origins, both in terms of the evolution of our species and of the developments in culture and society which led to the emergence of the first civilizations and to the more recent societies founded upon them. The research is thus an inquiry into ourselves and our beginnings, into how we have become what we are now, and how our worldview has come about. That is why it is a discipline of central relevance to the present time. Only in this way can we seek to achieve a long-term perspective upon the human condition. And it is worth emphasizing that archaeology is about the study of humans, not just artifacts and buildings for their own sake. The dynamic pace of change in archaeology is reflected in the continuing evolution of this book, particularly in the 7th edition. Each chapter and every element is reviewed and updated, incorporating new methods, changing theories, and fresh discoveries. This dynamism is driven in part by the range of research constantly underway in every part of the world, which in turn means that the data accessible to the archaeologist are increasing all the time. But new interpretations are not simply the product of new excavations turning up new information. They depend also upon the development of new techniques of inquiry. The field of archaeological science is a rapidly expanding one. We believe also that progress and deeper understanding come from the continuing developments in archaeological theory, and from the changing nature of the questions we pose when we approach these increasing amounts of data. The questions we ask, moreover, arise not only from academic research but from the prefactoll, for example, EEDTION, changing needs and perspectives of contemporary society, and from the different ways in which it comes to view its own past. The archaeology of the 21st century is now well underway. This point can be illustrated in a rather shocking way by the fortunes of war and civil unrest. All conflicts carry with them the risk of damage to the archaeological heritage. In Chapter 15, we describe the destruction of the 16th century bridge at Mostar after shelling by Croatian guns. We also explore the politics of destruction through the case of the mosque at Ayodhya in northern India, this time by Hindu fundamentalists. Great Britain is only now, in the wake of devastating attacks on archaeological sites by the Islamic State, planning to ratify the 1954 Hague Convention and its two protocols on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, as the United States did in 2009. It is sad to note that the religious intolerance underlying the events at Ayodhya was matched or even surpassed by the deliberate destruction by the Taliban of the great Buddhas at Bamiyan in Afghanistan. Again, we see a key part of the heritage of one sect or ethnic group deliberately destroyed by another. More recently, during the Arab Spring in Egypt of 2011, civil unrest allowed thieves to loot items from the famous Cairo Museum and Egyptian archaeological sites. The world was shocked by the destruction of, among other ancient monuments, the iconic man-faced winged bull at the Nergal Gate of Nineveh, Iraq, announced by Islamic State militants through a video released in February 2015. In the digital age, the opportunity to publicize such attacks on cultural heritage serves as a tool for both publicity and propaganda. All these tensions and losses underline the need for archaeologists, heritage managers, and museum curators to be vigilant and to proclaim at every opportunity the value of the ancient heritage for all humanity. How the book is organized. In archaeology, as in any scientific discipline, progress is achieved through asking the right questions. This book is founded upon that principle, and nearly every chapter is directed at how we can seek to answer the central questions of archaeology. Part 1, The Framework of Archaeology, begins with a chapter on the history of archaeology, an overview of how the discipline has grown and developed. In a sense, it answers the question, how did we get to be where we are? Past discoveries and ideas shape how we think about archaeology today. Then we come to the first major question, what? This addresses the subject matter of archaeology, namely the things that are left, and how the archaeological record is formed and how we can begin to recover it. The where question of Chapter 3 is answered in terms of archaeological prospection, survey, and excavation. The when question that follows is perhaps the most important so far, since archaeology is about the past, and about seeing things in the perspective of time, so that the procedures of absolute dating are central to the archaeological enterprise. Following this outline of the framework of what archaeology is about, we then move on to its subject matter. Some commentators and reviewers have expressed surprise that we begin Part 2 with the question, how are societies organized? For it sometimes seems easier to speak, for instance, about early subsistence or trade than about social organization. But in reality, the scale and nature of the society determines not only those issues, but more particularly governs how we as archaeologists can attempt to investigate them. In general, the rather scanty campsites of hunter-gatherers require a different approach from the formidable and deeply stratified cities of the first civilizations. There are exceptions, of course, and the case study on the Calusa of Florida discusses the approach to one of these, a sedentary and centralized, politically powerful society that was based almost entirely upon hunting, fishing, and gathering. We go on to ask in successive chapters how to investigate the environment of these early communities, their diet, their technology, and their trade. And when we come to ask in Chapter 10 what did they think, we are entering the field of cognitive archaeology, confronting new theoretical approaches such as agency, materiality, and engagement theory, which surface again when we ask why did things change? Encompassing the controversial areas of archaeological explanation. The structure, then, is in terms of questions, of what we want to know. Among the most fascinating questions are who were they? What were they like? Increasingly it is realized that the who question is a theoretically difficult one, involving matters of ethnicity and what ethnicity really means. Here we refer to new work in the fields of archaeogenetics and archaeolinguistics. The what were they like question can be answered in a number of new ways, including again the increasing use of archaeogenetics and DNA studies. Part 3 of the book, The World of Archaeology, shows in Chapter 13 how the questions of Parts 1 and 2 have been addressed in 5 exemplary field projects from around the world, from societies ranging from hunter-gatherers to complex civilizations and cities. The remaining 3 chapters look more widely at the question of who owns the past and management of the heritage, as well as careers in archaeology. We understand more clearly now that there are many archaeologies, depending upon the interests and the perspectives of the communities in different parts of the world that undertake the work, or of those who commission and pay for it, or of the wider public who are, in effect, the consumers of what the archaeologist produces. We are also coming to realize more clearly how the world of archaeology is governed by prevailing political beliefs. That is why archaeological ethics figures with ever-increasing prominence throughout the book. New to this edition. In the 6th edition of this book, we added a new final chapter, The New Searchers Building a Career in Archaeology. We chose 5 professional archaeologists, in mid-career, from different countries with different histories, and working in different branches of the archaeological field in research, in heritage management, in the museum. Gil Hay, a contract archaeologist based in the United Kingdom, now joins their ranks, as archaeological survey and excavation is increasingly guided by the need to respond to development projects. The aim is to glimpse the reality of archaeological practice today, or rather the different realities that the practicing archaeologist will encounter in actually doing good archaeology in different parts of the world. We have continued to update Chapter 3 to reflect the immense improvements and new techniques in aerial survey, including the use of drones to identify archaeological sites and features, and the use of digital data capture and recording systems, both on-site and in post-excavation analysis. A new box feature, Excavating an Urban Site, illustrates how archaeologists confront the challenges of excavation in continuously occupied towns and cities, using the example of the Museum of London Archaeology's Bloomberg project. In Chapter 4, we emphasize new and improved methods of dating archaeological remains, covering the emerging field of archaeogenetic dating and its implications for our reconstruction of human evolution, and the impact of the increased use of the uranium-thorium method on our understanding of the chronology of world cave art, even suggesting the possibility that particular artworks may be credited to the Neanderthals. Social archaeology, introduced in Chapter 5, continues to provoke lively debate, none more so than the meaning and interpretation of Stonehenge and its surroundings, 2 new boxes, Monuments, Polities and Territories in Early Wessex and Interpreting Stonehenge. Chart the progress of exciting research in this region, past and present, and discuss some of the latest theories about this iconic monument and its surrounding landscape. Another new box feature, Conspicuous Ranking at Mississippi and Spiro, demonstrates how archaeological theory informs our understanding of a site and the ancient society that created it, and how theory has grown with the discipline to inspire new interpretations of archaeological evidence. In Chapter 11, 2 new boxes introduce notable individuals from the past and investigate what their physical remains can reveal to us about diet, physique, health, clothing, and status, as well as examining the methods archaeologists employ to learn about these aspects of ancient life and death. The first, Denmark's Grobel Man, is one of Europe's Iron Age bog bodies, unfortunate individuals possibly sacrificed by their community, but astonishingly well preserved due to the conditions of the bogs in which they were interred. The second, England's King Richard III, was found beneath a Leicester car park in 2013. His discovery captured the imagination of the world's media, but both individuals, the anonymous and the famous, provide us with opportunities to learn directly about the people of the past. Once more, numerous specialists and course tutors have assisted with the preparation of this edition, providing detailed comments, information, or illustrations. We thank them by name in the acknowledgments at the back of the book, together with those many scholars who helped with earlier editions. Colin Renfrew Paul Bon. Archaeology is partly the discovery of the treasures of the past, partly the meticulous work of the scientific analyst, partly the exercise of the creative imagination. It is toiling in the sun on an excavation in the deserts of Central Asia, it is working with living Inuit in the snows of Alaska. It is diving down to Spanish wrecks off the coast of Florida, and it is investigating the sewers of Roman York. But it is also the painstaking task of interpretation so that we come to understand what these things mean for the human story. And it is the conservation of the world's cultural heritage against looting and against careless destruction. Archaeology, then, is both a physical activity out in the field and an intellectual pursuit in the study or laboratory. That is part of its great attraction. The rich mixture of danger and detective work has also made it the perfect vehicle for fiction writers and filmmakers, from Agatha Christie with Murder in Mesopotamia to Steven Spielberg with Indiana Jones. However far from reality such portrayals may be, they capture the essential truth that archaeology is an exciting quest, the quest for knowledge about ourselves and our past. But how does archaeology relate to disciplines such as anthropology and history that are also concerned with the human story? Is archaeology itself a science? And what are the responsibilities of the archaeologist in today's world, where the past is manipulated for political ends and ethnic cleansing is accompanied by the deliberate destruction of the cultural heritage? Archaeology as anthropology. Anthropology at its broadest is the study of humanity, our physical characteristics as animals, and our unique non-biological characteristics that we call culture. Culture in this sense includes what the anthropologist Edward Tyler usefully summarized in 1871 as knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Anthropologists also use the term culture in a more restricted sense when they refer to the culture of a particular society, meaning the non-biological characteristics unique to that society which distinguish it from other societies. An archaeological culture has a specific and somewhat different meaning, as explained in Chapter 3. Anthropology is thus a broad discipline, so broad that it is generally broken down into three smaller disciplines: biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, and archaeology. Biological anthropology, or physical anthropology as it used to be called, concerns the study of human biological or physical characteristics and how they evolved. Cultural anthropology or social anthropology analyzes human culture and society. Two of its branches are ethnography and ethnology. Archaeology is the past tense of cultural anthropology. Whereas cultural anthropologists will often base their conclusions on the experience of actually living within contemporary communities, archaeologists study past humans and societies primarily through their material remains, the buildings, tools, and other artifacts that constitute what is known as the material culture left over from former societies. Nevertheless, one of the most challenging tasks for the archaeologist today is to know how to interpret material culture in human terms. How were those pots used? Why are some dwellings round and others square? Here the methods of archaeology and ethnography overlap. Archaeologists in recent decades have developed ethnoarchaeology, where like ethnographers they live among contemporary communities, but with the specific purpose of understanding how such societies use material culture, how they make their tools and weapons, why they build their settlements where they do, and so on. Moreover, archaeology has an active role to play in the field of conservation. Heritage studies constitute a developing field where it is realized that the world's cultural heritage is a diminishing resource, and one which holds different meanings for different people. The presentation of the findings of archaeology to the public cannot avoid difficult political issues, and the museum curator and the popularizer today have responsibilities which some can be seen to have failed. Introduction. The nature and aims of archaeology. Archaeology as history. If, then, archaeology deals with the past, in what way does it differ from history? In the broadest sense, just as archaeology is an aspect of anthropology, so too is it a part of history. Where mean the whole history of humankind from its beginnings over 3 million years ago. Indeed, for more than 99% of that huge span of time, archaeology, the study of past material culture, is the only significant source of information, if one sets aside physical anthropology, which focuses on our biological rather than cultural progress. Conventional historical sources begin only with the introduction of written records around 3000 BC in Western Asia, and much later in most other parts of the world. A commonly drawn distinction is between prehistory, the period before written records, and history in the narrow sense, meaning the study of the past using written evidence. In some countries, prehistory is now considered a patronizing and derogatory term which implies that written texts are more valuable than oral histories, and which classifies their cultures as inferior until the arrival of Western ways of recording information. To archaeology, however, which studies all cultures and periods, whether with or without writing, the distinction between history and prehistory is a convenient dividing line that simply recognizes the importance of the written word in the modern world, but in no way denigrates the useful information contained in oral histories. As will become abundantly clear in this book, archaeology can also contribute a great deal to the understanding even of those periods and places where documents, inscriptions, and other literary evidence do exist. Quite often, it is the archaeologist who unearths such evidence in the first place. Archaeology as a science. Since the aim of archaeology is the understanding of humankind, it is a humanistic discipline, a humane study. And since it deals with the human past, it is a historical discipline. But it differs from the study of written history. Alt-Hot uses written history in a fundamental way. The material the archaeologist finds does not tell us directly what to think. Historical records make statements, offer opinions, pass judgments. The objects that archaeologists discover, on the other hand, tell us nothing directly in themselves. It is we today who have to make sense of these things. In this respect, the practice of archaeology is rather like that of the scientist. The scientist collects data, conducts experiments, formulates a hypothesis, tests the hypothesis against more data, and then in conclusion devises a model. The archaeologist has to develop a picture of the past, just as the scientist has to develop a coherent view of the natural world. It is not found ready-made. Archaeology, in short, is a science as well as a humanity. That is one of its fascinations as a discipline. It reflects the ingenuity of the modern scientist as well as the modern historian. The technical methods of archaeological science are the most obvious, from radiocarbon dating to studies of food residues in pots. Equally important are scientific methods of analysis, of inference. Some writers have spoken of the need to define a separate middle-range theory, referring to a distinct body of ideas to bridge the gap between raw archaeological evidence and the general observations and conclusions to be derived from it. That is one way of looking at the matter. But we see no need to make a sharp distinction between theory and method. Our aim is to describe clearly the methods and techniques used by archaeologists in investigating the past. The analytical concepts of the archaeologist are as much a part of that battery of approaches as are the instruments in the laboratory. 0.1 The vast time span of prehistory compared with the relatively short period for which we have written records. Before circa 3000 BC, material remains are our only evidence. Introduction: The nature and aims of archaeology. The diversity of modern archaeology. This page, 0.2 Urban archaeology, excavation of a Roman site in the heart of London. 0.3 Working in the on-site archaeobotanical laboratory on finds from Çatalhöyük in Turkey. 0.4 An ethnoarchaeologist in the field in Siberia, sharing and studying the lives of modern origin people, here making blood sausages from the intestines of a recently butchered reindeer. Opposite, 0.5 Underwater archaeology, a huge Egyptian statue found in the now submerged ruins of an ancient city near Alexandria. 0.6 An Inca mummy, now known as the Ice Maiden, is lifted from her resting place high up on the Ambato volcano in Peru. 0.7 Piecing together fragments of an elaborate mural from the early Maya site of San Bartolo in Guatemala. 0.8 Salvaged in advance of development, a 2,000-year-old Western Han Dynasty tomb is excavated at a construction site in Guangzhou, China. The variety and scope of archaeology. Today, archaeology is a broad church, encompassing a number of different archaeologies which are nevertheless united by the methods and approaches outlined in this book. We have already highlighted the distinction between the archaeology of the long prehistoric period and that of historic times. This chronological division is accentuated by further subdivisions so that archaeologists specialize in, say, the earliest periods or the later ones. A major development in the last 2 or 3 decades has been the realization that archaeology has much to contribute also to the more recent historic periods. In North America and Australia, historical archaeology, the archaeological study of colonial and post-colonial settlement, has expanded greatly, as has medieval and post-medieval archaeology in Europe. So whether we are speaking of colonial Jamestown in the United States, or medieval London, Paris, and Hamburg in Europe, archaeology is a prime source of evidence. Cutting across these chronological subdivisions are specializations that can contribute to many different archaeological periods. Environmental archaeology is one such field, where archaeologists and specialists from other sciences study the human use of plants and animals, and how past societies adapted to the ever-changing environment. Underwater archaeology is another such field, demanding great courage as well as skill. In the last 40 years, it has become a highly scientific exercise, yielding time capsules from the past in the form of shipwrecks that shed new light on ancient life on land as well as at sea. Ethnoarchaeology, too, as we discussed briefly above, is a major specialization in modern archaeology. We now realize that we can only understand the archaeological record, that is to say, what we find, if we understand in much greater detail how it came about, how it was formed. Formation processes are now a focus of intensive study. It is here that ethnoarchaeology has come into its own, the study of living peoples and of their material culture undertaken with the aim of improving our understanding of the archaeological record. For instance, the study of butchery practices among living hunter-gatherers undertaken by Louis Binford among the Nunavut Eskimo of Alaska gave him many new ideas about the way the archaeological record may have been formed, allowing him to re-evaluate the bone remains of animals eaten by very early humans elsewhere in the world. Nor are these studies confined to simpler communities or small groups. Contemporary material culture has now become a focus of study in its own right. The archaeology of the 21st century already ranges from the design of Coca-Cola bottles and beer cans to the forensic pathology increasingly used in the investigation of war crimes and atrocities, whether in Bosnia, West Africa, or Iraq. Actualistic studies in archaeology were pioneered in the Garbage Project set up by William L. Rathje, who studied the refuse of different sectors of the city of Tucson, Arizona, to give insights into the patterns of consumption of the modern urban population. Sites such as airfields and gun emplacements dating from World War 0.9 Today, the conventions, idioms, and findings of archaeology are increasingly referenced in contemporary society, including contemporary art. Antony Gormley's field for the British Isles is made up of thousands of terracotta figures resembling prehistoric figurines from excavations in Mesoamerica or Southeast Europe. For the viewer in front of them, the effect is overpowering. Chairman Mao coined the slogan "Let the past serve the present," but that was sometimes used as an excuse for the deliberate destruction of ancient things. The commercial exploitation of the past also raises many problems. Many archaeological sites are today overvisited, and the large numbers of well-meaning tourists pose real problems for their conservation. This has been a long-standing problem at Stonehenge, the major prehistoric monument in South Britain, and the failure of the UK government to do anything effective about the situation over many decades brought general condemnation. Most serious of all, perhaps, is the connivance of major museums in the looting of the world's archaeological heritage through the purchase of illicit and unprovenienced antiquities. The settlement of the restitution claims made by the Italian government against the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Getty Museum in Malibu, and the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the return to Italy of looted antiquities raise questions about the integrity of some museum directors and trustees, well-informed people whom one would expect to be the guardians and defenders of the past, not participants in the commercial processes which lead to its destruction. Aims and questions. If our aim is to learn about the human past, there remains the major issue of what we hope to learn. Traditional approaches tended to regard the objective of archaeology mainly as reconstruction, piecing together the jigsaw. But today it is not enough simply to recreate the material culture of remote periods, or to complete the picture for more recent ones. A further objective has been termed the reconstruction of the lifeways of the people responsible for the archaeological remains. We are certainly interested in having a clear picture of how people lived, and how they exploited their environment. But we also seek to understand why they lived that way, why they had those patterns of behavior, and how their lifeways and material culture came to take the form they did. We are interested, in short, in explaining change. This interest in the processes of cultural change came to define what is known as processual archaeology. Processual archaeology moves forward by asking a series of questions, just as any scientific study proceeds by defining aims of study, formulating questions, and then proceeding to answer them. The symbolic and cognitive aspects of societies are also important areas emphasized by recent approaches, often grouped together under the term post-processual or interpretive archaeology, although the apparent unity of this perspective has now diversified into a variety of. Two are now preserved as ancient monuments, as are telecommunication facilities from the era of the Cold War, and surviving fragments of the Berlin Wall which once divided East from West Germany but which was opened and torn down in 1989. The Nevada Test Site, established in 1950 as a continental location for United States weapons testing, is similarly now the subject of archaeological research and conservation. The archaeology of the 20th century even had its looters. Artifacts raised from the wreck of the Titanic have been sold for large sums to private collectors. And the archaeology of the 21st century had a grim start with the recovery work following the catastrophic destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001. Ground Zero, the conserved and protected site where the Twin Towers once stood, has taken its place as one of the most notable of the commemorative monuments of New York. Archaeology today continues to develop new specialisms and subdisciplines. Out of the environmental approach widely emphasized at the end of the 20th century, bioarchaeology has emerged, the study of plants and animals in the human environment and diet. So too geoarchaeology, the application to archaeology of the geological sciences, for the reconstruction of early environments and the study of lithic materials. Archaeogenetics, the study of the human past using the techniques of molecular genetics, is a rapidly expanding field. These, and other emerging areas, such as forensic anthropology, are the product both of developments in the sciences and of increasing awareness among archaeologists as to how such developments can be exploited in the study of the past. The ethics of archaeology. Increasingly it is realized that the practice of archaeology raises many ethical problems, and that the uses of archaeology, politically and commercially, nearly always raise questions with a moral or ethical dimension. It is easy to see that the deliberate destruction of archaeological remains, such as the demolition of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan or the leveling of Nineveh and other sites by the so-called Islamic State, are essentially evil acts, judged by most moral standards. Comparable in its damaging consequences was the deplorable failure of the coalition forces that invaded Iraq to safeguard the archaeological treasures and sites of that country. But other issues are less obvious. In what circumstances should the existence of archaeological sites be allowed to impede the progress of important construction projects, such as new roads or new dams? During the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Concerns. It is persuasively argued that in the postmodern world different communities and social groups have their own interests and preoccupations, that each may have its voice and its own distinctive construction of the past, and that in this sense there are many archaeologies. This becomes particularly clear when one looks at the newly formed nations of the Third World, where different and sometimes competing ethnic groups have their own traditions and interests, and in some senses their own archaeologies. There are many big questions that preoccupy us today. We want to understand the circumstances in which our human ancestors first emerged. Was this in Africa and only in Africa, as currently seems the case? Were these early humans proper hunters or merely scavengers? What were the circumstances in which our own species Homo sapiens evolved? How do we explain the emergence of Paleolithic art? How did the shift from hunting and gathering to farming come about in Western Asia, in Mesoamerica, and in other parts of the world? Why did this happen in the course of just a few millennia? How do we explain the rise of cities, apparently quite independently in different parts of the world? How are identities formed, both of individuals and of groups? How do we decide which aspects of the cultural heritage of a region or nation are worth conserving? The list of questions goes on, and after these general questions there are more specific ones. We wish to know why a particular culture took the form it did, how its particularities emerged, and how they influenced developments. This book does not set out to review the provisional answers to all these questions, although many of the impressive results of archaeology will emerge in the following pages. In this book we examine rather the methods by which such questions can be answered. Plan of the book. The methods of archaeology could be surveyed in many different ways. As mentioned in the preface, we have chosen to think in terms of the many kinds of questions to which we wish to have answers, and we list them briefly again here. It could be argued that the whole philosophy of archaeology is implied in the questions we ask and the form in which we frame them. Part 1 reviews the whole field of archaeology, looking first at the history of the subject, and then asking 3 specific questions: how are materials preserved, how are they found, and how are they dated? Part 2 sets out further and more searching questions about social organization, about environment, and about subsistence, about technology and trade, and about the way people thought and communicated. We then ask what they were like physically. And finally, the interesting question is posed: why things changed. Part 3 is a review of archaeology in practice, showing how the different ideas and techniques can be brought together in field projects. 5 such projects are chosen as case studies, from southern Mexico, Florida in the south of the United States, southeastern Australia, Thailand, and urban York in England. In conclusion, there are 2 chapters on the subject of public archaeology, discussing the uses and abuses of archaeology in the modern world, and the obligations these things have placed on the archaeologist and on all those who exploit the past for gain or for political purposes. Finally, our last chapter gives the personal stories of 6 archaeologists working in different areas of the world and in various fields. In this way, we plan that the book should give a good overview of the whole range of methods and ideas of archaeological investigation. The following books give an indication of the rich variety of archaeology today. Most of them have good illustrations. Bond, P.G. 2000, The World Atlas of Archaeology. Facts on File, New York. Bond, P.G. 2001, The Penguin Archaeology Guide. Penguin, London. Cunliffe, B., Davies, W., and Renfrew, C. 2002. Archaeology, The Widening Debate. British Academy, London. Fagan, B.M. 2007, Discovery. Unearthing the New Treasures of Archaeology. Thames and Hudson, London and New York. Forte, M., and Ciliati, A., 1997. Virtual Archaeology. Thames and Hudson, London, Abrams, New York. Further reading. Renfrew C. and Bond P. 2014. The Cambridge World Prehistory. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. 3 volumes Scar, C. 1999. The 70 Wonders of the Ancient World. The Great Monuments and How They Were Built. Thames and Hudson, London and New York. Scar, C. 2013. The Human Past. World Prehistory and the Development of Human Societies. Thames and Hudson, London and New York. Schofield, J. 1998. Monuments of War, the Evaluation, Recording and Management of 20th Century Military Sites. English Heritage, London. Archaeology is concerned with the full range of past human experience, how people organized themselves into social groups and exploited their surroundings, what they ate, made, and believed, how they communicated and why their societies changed. These are the engrossing questions we address later in the book. First, however, we need a framework in space and time. It is little use beginning our pursuit of ideas and methods concerning the past without knowing what materials archaeologists study, or where these might be found and how they are dated. Indeed, we also want to know how far previous generations of archaeologists have traveled and along which roads before setting off on our own journey of discovery. Part 1 therefore focuses on the fundamental framework of archaeology. The first chapter looks at the history of the discipline, showing in particular how successive workers have redefined and enlarged the questions we ask about the past. Then we pose the first question, what is preserved, and what is the range of archaeological materials that have come down to us? The second question, where, addresses methods for finding and surveying sites, and principles of excavation and preliminary analysis. Our third question, when, considers the human experience of time and its measurement, and assesses the huge battery of techniques now available to help the archaeologists date the past. On this basis we are able to set out a chronology summarizing the human story, as a conclusion to Part 1 and a prelude to Part 2. Part 1. Tehe from EWORK of ARCHAEOLOGY. 1. The history of archaeology is commonly seen as the history of great discoveries, the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, the lost Maya cities of Mexico, the painted caves of the Old Stone Age, such as Lascaux in France, or the remains of our human ancestors buried deep in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. But even more than that, it is the story of how we have come to look with fresh eyes at the material evidence for the human past, and with new methods to aid us in our task. It is important to remember that just a century and a half ago, most well-read people in the Western world, where archaeology as we know it today was first developed, believed that the world had been created only a few thousand years earlier, and that all that could be known of the remote past had to be gleaned from the surviving pages of the earliest historians, notably those of the ancient Near East, Egypt, and Greece. There was no awareness that any kind of coherent history of the periods before the development of writing was possible at all. In the words of the Danish scholar Rasmus Nyerup, everything which has come down to us from heathendom is wrapped in a thick fog. It belongs to a space of time which we cannot measure. We know that it is older than Christendom, but whether by a couple of years or a couple of centuries, or even by more than a millennium, we can do no more than guess. Today we can indeed penetrate that thick fog of the remote past. This is not simply because new discoveries are being made all the time. It is because we have learned to ask some of the right questions, and have developed some of the right methods for answering them. The material evidence of the archaeological record has been lying around for a long time. What is new is our awareness that the methods of archaeology can give us information about the past, even the prehistoric past. The history of archaeology is therefore in the first instance a history of ideas, of theory, of ways of looking at the past. Next, it is a history of developing research methods, employing those ideas and investigating those questions. And only thirdly is it a history of actual discoveries. We can illustrate the relationship between these aspects of our knowledge of the past with a simple diagram. In this chapter and in this book, it is the development of the questions and ideas that we shall emphasize, and the application of new research methods. The main thing to remember is that every view of the past is a product of its own time. Ideas and theories are constantly evolving, and so are methods. When we describe the archaeological research methods of today, we are simply speaking of one point on a trajectory of evolution. In a few decades or even a few years' time, these methods will certainly look old-fashioned and out of date. That is the dynamic nature of archaeology as a discipline. 1.1 The Roman city of Pompeii lies in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius in Italy. When the volcano erupted in AD 79, the entire city was buried, all but forgotten until excavations began in the mid-18th century. Spectacular discoveries generated huge interest in the past and greatly influenced the arts. THECARCHERS. The history of archaeology. The speculative phase. 1.3 A page from the commonplace book of William Stukeley, with a sketch plan of standing stones at Avebury, southern England. Humans have always speculated about their past, and most cultures have their own foundation myths to explain why society is how it is. The Greek writer Hesiod, for instance, who lived around 800 BC, in his epic poem Works and Days envisaged the human past as falling into 5 stages: the age of gold and the immortals, who dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things; the age of silver, when humans were less noble; the age of bronze, the age of epic heroes; and lastly his own time, the age of iron and dread sorrow, when men never rest from labor and sorrow by day and from perishing by night. Most cultures, too, have been fascinated by the societies that preceded them. The Aztecs exaggerated their Toltec ancestry and were so interested in Teotihuacan, the huge Mexican city abandoned hundreds of years earlier, which they mistakenly linked with the Toltecs, that they incorporated ceremonial stone masks from that site in the foundation deposits of their own great temple. A rather more detached curiosity about the relics of bygone ages developed in several early civilizations, where scholars and even rulers collected and studied objects from the past. Nabonidus, last native king of Babylon, took a keen interest in antiquities. In one important temple he dug down and discovered the foundation stone, which had been laid some 2,200 years before. He housed many of his finds in a kind of museum at Babylon. During the revival of learning in Europe known as the Renaissance, princes and people of refinement began to form cabinets of curiosities in which curios and ancient artifacts were displayed with exotic minerals and all manner of specimens illustrative of what was called natural history. During the Renaissance also scholars began to study and collect the relics of classical antiquity. And they began too in more northern lands, far from the civilized centers of ancient Greece and Rome, to study the local relics of their own remote past. At this time these were mainly the field monuments, those conspicuous sites, often made of stone, which immediately attracted attention, such as the great stone tombs of northwestern Europe, and such impressive sites as Stonehenge, or Karnak in Brittany. Careful scholars, such as the Englishman William Stukeley, made systematic studies of some of these monuments, with accurate plans which are still useful today. Stukeley and his colleagues successfully demonstrated that these monuments had not been constructed by giants or devils, as suggested by local names such as the Devil's Arrows, but by people in Native Americans, but by a mythical and vanished race of mound builders. Jefferson adopted what today we should call a scientific approach, that is, he tested ideas about the mounds against hard evidence by excavating one of them. His methods were careful enough to allow him to recognize different layers in his trench and to see that the many human bones present were less well preserved in the lower layers. From this he deduced that the mound had been reused as a place of burial on many separate occasions. Although Jefferson admitted, rightly, that more evidence was needed to resolve the mound builder question, he saw no reason why ancestors of the present-day Native Americans themselves could not have raised the mounds. Jefferson was ahead of his time. His sound approach. Logical deduction from carefully excavated evidence, in many ways the basis of modern archaeology, was not taken up by any of his immediate successors in North America. In Europe, meanwhile, extensive excavations were being conducted, for instance by the Englishman Richard Colt Hoare, who dug into hundreds of burial mounds in southern Britain during the first decade of the 19th century. He successfully divided field monuments into different categories, such as Bell Barrow, which are still in use today. None of these excavations, however, did much to advance the cause of knowledge about the distant past, since their interpretation was still within the biblical framework, which insisted on a short span for human existence. Antiquity. He was also successful in phasing field monuments, showing that, since Roman roads cut barrows, the former must be later than the latter. In the same period, around 1675, the first archaeological excavation of the New World, a tunnel dug into Teotihuacan's Pyramid of the Moon, was carried out by Carlos de Siguenza y Góngora. The first excavations. In the 18th century, more adventurous researchers initiated excavation of some of the most prominent sites. Pompeii in Italy was one of the first of these, with its striking Roman finds, although proper excavation did not begin there until the 19th century. And in 1765, at the Huaca de Tantaluc on the coast of Peru, a mound was excavated and an offering discovered in a hollow. The mound's stratigraphy was well described. Nevertheless, the credit for conducting what has been called the first scientific excavation in the history of archaeology traditionally goes to Thomas Jefferson, later in his career third President of the United States, who in 1784 dug a trench or section across a burial mound on his property in Virginia. Jefferson's work marks the beginning of the end of the speculative phase. In Jefferson's time, people were speculating that the hundreds of unexplained mounds known east of the Mississippi River had been built not by the indigenous. 1.4 Early excavations. Richard Colt Hoare and William Cunnington direct a dig north of Stonehenge in 1805. Digging Pompeii, Past and Present. 1.6 How a body shape is retrieved. In the history of archaeology, the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum, lying at the foot of Mount Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples, Italy, hold a very special place. Even today, when so many major sites have been systematically excavated, it is a moving experience to visit these wonderfully preserved Roman cities. Pompeii's fate was sealed on the momentous day in August AD 79 when Vesuvius erupted, a cataclysmic event described by Pliny the Younger, a Roman writer. The city was buried under several meters of volcanic ash, many of the inhabitants being asphyxiated as they tried to flee. Herculaneum was buried to an even greater depth. There the complete cities lay, known only from occasional chance discoveries, until antiquarian curiosity grew in the early 18th century. In 1709 the Prince of Elbeuf, learning of the discovery of worked marble in the vicinity, proceeded to investigate by shafts and tunnels what we now know to be the site of Herculaneum. He had the good luck to discover the ancient theater, the first complete Roman example ever found, but he was mainly interested in works of art for his collection. These he removed without any kind of record of their location. Following Elbeuf, clearance resumed in a slightly more systematic way in 1738 at Herculaneum, and in 1748 Pompeii was discovered. Work proceeded under the patronage of the King and Queen of Naples, but they did little more than quarry ancient masterpieces to embellish their royal palace. Shortly afterwards, on the outskirts of Herculaneum, the remains of a splendid villa were revealed, with statues and an entire library of carbonized papyri that have given the complex its name, the Villa of the Papyri. The villa's dimensions were closely followed by J. Paul Getty in the construction of his museum at Malibu, California. The first catalogue of the royal collection was published in 1757. 5 years later, the German scholar Johann Joachim Winckelmann, often regarded as the father of classical archaeology, published his first letter on the discoveries at Herculaneum. From that time onward, the finds from both cities attracted enormous international attention, influencing styles of furniture and interior decoration, and inspiring several pieces of romantic fiction. Not until 1860, however, when Giuseppe Fiorelli was put in charge of the work at Pompeii, did well-recorded excavations begin. In 1864, Fiorelli devised a brilliant way of dealing with the cavities in the ash within which skeletons were found. He simply filled them with plaster of Paris. The ash around the cavity acted as a mold, and the plaster took the accurate shape of the decayed body. 1.5 Sketch plan of Pompeii, showing the excavated areas. Pompeii, Italy. During the 20th century, Amedeo Maiuri excavated at Pompeii between 1924 and 1961, and for the first time systematic excavations were carried out beneath the AD 79 ground level, revealing remains of earlier phases of the town. In recent years, his work has been supplemented by targeted excavations by many international teams of archaeologists. This work has uncovered a complex history of changing property boundaries and land use, revealing how Pompeii grew from a small rural settlement into a sophisticated Roman town and throwing much new light on its social and economic development. Pompeii remains the most complete urban excavation ever undertaken. The town plan is clear in its essentials. Most of the public buildings have been investigated, along with innumerable shops and private houses. Yet the potential for further study and interpretation is enormous. Today it is not difficult for the visitor to Pompeii to echo the words of Shelley in his Ode to Naples, written more than a century and a half ago. I stood within the city disinterred, and heard the autumnal leaves like light footfalls of spirits passing through the streets. And heard the mountain's slumberous voice at intervals thrill through those roofless halls. 1.7 10 Early 20th century excavations of the Via dell'Abbondanza, Pompeii's main thoroughfare. Wall painting from the House of the Chaste Lovers, a slave girl watches two couples enjoying a banquet. Plaster, poured into the cavity left by the body, recreates the shape of a Pompeian struck down in flight. Preservation conditions at Pompeii are remarkable. Carbonized eggs are among the survivors. Published in 1859, established the concept of evolution as the best explanation for the origin and development of all plants and animals. The idea of evolution itself was not new. Earlier scholars had suggested that living things must have changed or evolved through the ages. What Darwin demonstrated was how this change occurred. The key mechanism was, in Darwin's words, natural selection, or the survival of the fittest. In the struggle for existence, environmentally better adapted individuals of a particular species would survive, whereas less well-adapted ones would die. The surviving individuals would pass on their advantageous traits by heredity to their offspring, and gradually the characteristics of a species would change to such an extent that a new species emerged. This was the process of evolution. Darwin's other great work, The Descent of Man, was not published until 1871, but already the implications were clear, that the human species had emerged as part of this same process. The search for human origins in the material record, by the techniques of archaeology, could begin. The three-age system. As we have seen, some of these techniques, notably in the field of excavation, were already being developed. So too was another conceptual device which proved very useful for the progress of European prehistory, the three-age system. As early as 1808, Colt Hoare had recognized. It was not until the mid-19th century that the discipline of archaeology became truly established. Already in the background were significant achievements in the newly developed science of geology. The Scottish geologist James Hutton, in his Theory of the Earth, had studied the stratification of rocks, establishing principles which were to be the basis of archaeological excavation, as foreshadowed by Jefferson. Hutton showed that the stratification of rocks was due to processes still ongoing in seas, rivers, and lakes. This was the principle of uniformitarianism. Charles Lyell also argued, in his Principles of Geology, that geologically ancient conditions were in essence similar to, or uniform with, those of our own time. This idea could be applied to the human past also, and marks one of the fundamental notions of modern archaeology, that in many ways the past was much like the present. The antiquity of humankind. These ideas did much to lay the groundwork for what was one of the significant events in the intellectual history of the 19th century, the establishment of the antiquity of humankind. It was a French customs inspector, Jacques Boucher de Perthes, working in the gravel quarries of the Somme River, who in 1841 published convincing evidence for the association there of human artifacts and the bones of extinct animals. Boucher de Perthes argued that this indicated human existence for a long time before the biblical flood. His view did not at first win wide acceptance, but in 1859 two leading British scholars, John Evans and Joseph Prestwich, visited him in France and were persuaded of the validity of his findings. It was now widely agreed that human origins extended far back into a remote past, so that the biblical notion of the creation of the world just a few thousand years before our own time could no longer be accepted. The possibility of a prehistory of humankind, indeed the need for one, was established. The term itself came into general use after the publication of John Lubbock's book Prehistoric Times in 1865, which went on to become a bestseller. The concept of evolution. These ideas harmonized well with the findings of another great scholar of the 19th century, Charles Darwin, whose fundamental work, On the Origin of Species. 1.11 The title page of Darwin's book, his ideas about evolution proved highly influential, not least in archaeology. The beginnings of modern archaeology. The idea of evolution has been of central significance in the development of archaeological thinking. In the first place, it is associated with the name of Charles Darwin, whose On the Origin of Species effectively explained the problem of the origin and development of the plant and animal species, including humankind. It did so by insisting that within a species there is variation, that the transmission of physical traits is by heredity alone, and that natural selection determines survival. Darwin certainly had precursors, among whom Thomas Malthus was influential with his notion of competition through population pressure, and the geologist Charles Lyell with his insistence upon gradual change. The impact on archaeology. Darwin's work had an immediate effect on archaeologists such as Pitt Rivers, John Evans, and Oscar Montelius, laying the foundations for the study of the typology of artifacts. His influence on social thinkers and anthropologists was even more significant. Among them was Karl Marx. The application of the principles of evolution to social organization does not always follow the detailed mechanisms of hereditary transmission which apply to the biologically defined species. For culture can be learned and passed on between generations more widely than between parents and their children. Often, indeed, the term evolutionary applied to an argument or an explanation simply means generalizing. Here it is important to be aware of the great swing in anthropology at the end of the 19th century away from the cultural evolutionism, with books such as The Evolution of Culture. White and Stewart strongly influenced the new archaeologists of the 1960s and 1970s, in particular Louis Binford, Kent Flannery, and D.L. Clark. Recent approaches. Evolutionary thinking has naturally continued to play a major role in the consideration of human origins. Drift, and all it implies, was an important factor in biological evolution in addition to natural selection. It has been appreciated that the process of evolution does not need to be gradual. The concept of punctuated equilibrium has come into play. Nor need it be simple. The role of self-organizing systems and catastrophe theory are discussed in Chapter 12. Nor does the debate, dominant in the United States, on intelligent design seem helpful. It is no more than an update of traditional arguments for the existence of God, modified to avoid the identity of the designer. It is not science. But increasingly it is realized that Darwinian evolutionary thought has not yet produced mechanisms which adequately describe the processes involved in human cultural development. Richard Dawkins' notion of the meme, supposedly a specific and transmissionable agent for change based on the concept of the gene, has not proved useful in practice. Nor has the application of evolutionary psychology yet solved many problems. There is no suggestion here that the application of Darwinian evolutionary theory is incorrect or inappropriate. In fact, there are indications now that computer-aided simulation studies and approaches to diversification, applied to linguistics and material culture as well as to molecular genetics, are opening new avenues to its application. 1.12 Charles Darwin caricatured as an ape, published in 1874. The drawing was captioned with a line from William Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, "This is the ape of form." Broad generalizations of Lewis Henry Morgan and Edward Tyler in favor of a much more detailed, descriptive approach, often termed historical particularism, and associated with the anthropologist Franz Boas. In the years before and after World War II, American anthropologists like Leslie White and Julian Stewart were therefore innovators in rejecting Boas and seeking to generalize, to find explanations for long-term change. White was for many years the only protagonist of what may be termed evolution, Darwin's great idea. These three great conceptual advances, the antiquity of humankind, Darwin's principle of evolution, and the 3H system, at last offered a framework for studying the past and for asking intelligent questions about it. Darwin's ideas were influential also in another way. They suggested that human cultures might have evolved in a manner analogous to plant and animal species. Soon after 1859, British scholars such as General Pitt Rivers and John Evans were devising schemes for the evolution of artifact forms, which gave rise to the method of typology, the arrangement of artifacts in chronological or developmental sequence, later greatly elaborated by the Swedish scholar Oscar Montelius. Ethnography and archaeology. Another important strand in the thought of the time was the realization that the study by ethnographers of living communities in different parts of the world could be a useful starting point for archaeologists seeking to understand something of the lifestyles of their own early native inhabitants who clearly had comparably simple tools and crafts. For example, contact with indigenous communities in North America provided antiquarians and historians with models for tattooed images of Celts and Britons, and a sequence of stone, brass, and iron artifacts within the barrows he excavated, but this was first systematically studied when, in 1836, the Danish scholar C.J. Thomsen published his guidebook to the National Museum of Copenhagen. This appeared in English in 1848 as the Guide to Northern Archaeology. Thomsen proposed that the collections could be divided into those coming from a Stone Age, a Bronze Age, and an Iron Age. This system was soon found useful by scholars throughout Europe. A division in the Stone Age was later established between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. These terms were less applicable to Africa, where bronze was not used south of the Sahara, or to the Americas, where bronze was less important and iron was not used before the European conquest. But it was conceptually significant. The 3H system established the principle that by studying and classifying prehistoric artifacts one could produce a chronological ordering and say something of the periods in question. Archaeology was moving beyond mere speculation about the past, becoming instead a discipline involving careful excavation and systematic study of the artifacts unearthed, although superseded by chronometric dating methods. The 3H system remains one of the fundamental divisions of archaeological materials today. 1.13 C.J. Thomsen shows visitors around the Danish National Museum, arranged according to his 3H system. 1.14 The influence of Darwin is evident in these early typologies. John Evans sought to derive the Celtic British coinage, bottom, from the gold stater of Philip of Macedon, top. Montelius' arrangement of Iron Age F. Bewley, showing their evolution. Egypt and the Near East also held a fascination for the American lawyer and diplomat John Lloyd Stevens. But it was in the New World that he was to make his name. His travels in Yucatan, Mexico, with the English artist Frederick Catherwood, and the superbly illustrated books they produced together in the early 1840s, revealed for the first time to an enthusiastic public the ruined cities of the ancient Maya. Unlike contemporary researchers in North America, who continued to argue for a vanished white race of mound builders as the architects of the earthworks there, Stevens rightly believed that the Maya monuments were the creation of the same races who inhabited the country at the time of the Spanish conquest. Stevens also noted, scholars such as Daniel Wilson and John Lubbock made systematic use of such an ethnographic approach. And at the same time ethnographers and anthropologists were themselves producing schemes of human progress. Strongly influenced by Darwin's ideas about evolution, the British anthropologist Edward Tylor and his American counterpart Lewis Henry Morgan both published important works in the 1870s arguing that human societies had evolved from a state of savagery through barbarism to civilization. Morgan's book, Ancient Society, was partly based on his great knowledge of living Native Americans. His ideas, particularly the notion that people had once lived in a state of primitive communism, sharing resources equally, strongly influenced Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who drew on them in their writings about pre-capitalist societies, thus influencing many later Marxist archaeologists. Discovering the early civilizations. By the 1880s, then, many of the ideas underlying modern archaeology had been developed. But these ideas themselves took shape against a background of major 19th-century discoveries of ancient civilizations in the Old World and the New. The splendors of ancient Egyptian civilization had already been brought to the attention of an avid public after Napoleon's military expedition of 1798-1800. It was the discovery by one of his soldiers of the Rosetta Stone that eventually provided the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Inscribed on the stone are identical texts written in both Egyptian and Greek scripts. The Frenchman Jean-François Champollion used this bilingual inscription to decipher the hieroglyphs in 1822, after 14 years' work. A similar piece of brilliant scholarly detection helped unlock the secrets of cuneiform writing, the script used for many languages in ancient Mesopotamia. In the 1840s, the French and British, under Paul-Émile Botta and Austen Henry Layard, respectively, had vied with one another using crude excavations to see which side could obtain from the Mesopotamian ruins the largest number of works of art with the least possible outlay of time and money. Layard became famous for his discoveries, which included huge Assyrian sculptures of winged bulls and a great library of cuneiform tablets from the site of Kuyunjik. But it was only the final decipherment of cuneiform by Henry Rawlinson in the 1850s, building on the work of others, that proved that Kuyunjik was biblical Nineveh. Rawlinson spent 20 years studying a 6th century BC trilingual inscription located on an inaccessible cliff face between Baghdad and Tehran before cracking the cuneiform code. 1.15 Frederick Catherwood's accurate, if somewhat romantic, drawing of a stela at Köpen, at the time of his visit to the site in 1840 Maya glyphs had not yet been deciphered. North American archaeological pioneers. 1.17 Squire. Two themes dominate the study of North American archaeology in the 19th century: the enduring belief in a vanished race of mound builders, and the search for glacial man, the idea, sparked off by Boucher de Perda's Somme River discoveries in mid-century, that human fossils and Stone Age tools would be found in the Americas in association with extinct animals, as they had been in Europe. One way to gain insight into these issues is to view them through the work of some of the main protagonists. Caleb Atwater, the newly formed American Antiquarian Society's first transactions, Archaeologia Americana, contained a paper by Atwater, a local postmaster, on burial mounds and earthworks around Circleville, Ohio. His survey work is valuable since the mounds he studied were already disappearing fast, and are now gone. But he took little interest in their contents, and his interpretations were idiosyncratic. Atwater divided the mounds into three periods: modern European, modern Native American, and those built by the original mound builder people whom he believed to have been Hindus from India who later moved on to Mexico. Ephraim Squire Squire was an Ohio newspaperman who later became a diplomat. He is best known for his work on the prehistoric mounds with Edwin Davis, an Ohio physician. Between 1845 and 1847 they excavated over 200 mounds and accurately surveyed many other earthworks. Their landmark volume of 1848, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, was the first publication of the newly founded Smithsonian Institution and is still useful. It recorded hundreds of mounds, including many being destroyed as settlers moved westward, gave cross-sections and plans, and adopted a simple classification system which inferred function in a general way. Like most of their contemporaries, Squire and Davis considered the mounds to be beyond the capabilities of any Native Americans, thought of as hunters averse to labor, and so they maintained the myth of the intrusive race of mound builders. Samuel Haven, as librarian of the American Antiquarian Society, Haven built up an encyclopedic knowledge of publications on American archaeology. From this wealth of reading he produced a remarkable synthesis in 1856, The Archaeology of the United States, published by the Smithsonian Institution, which is considered a foundation stone of modern American archaeology. In it, Haven argued persuasively that the Native Americans were of great antiquity, and, through cranial and other physical characteristics, he pointed to their probable links with Asiatic races. Disagreeing strongly with Atwater and Squire, he concluded that the mysterious mounds had been built by the ancestors of living Native Americans. The controversy continued to rage, but Haven's rigorous approach paved the way for the resolution of the issue by John Wesley Powell and Cyrus Thomas. 1.16 Squire and Davis's 1846 Plan of Serpent Mound, Ohio. John Wesley Powell, raised in the Midwest, Powell spent much of his youth digging into mounds and learning geology. Eventually he was appointed director of the U.S. Geographical and Geological Survey of the Rocky Mountain region. He published a wide range of information on the rapidly dwindling Native American cultures. Moving to Washington, this energetic scholar headed not only the Geological Survey but also his own brainchild, the Bureau of American Ethnology, set up to study the native North Americans. A fearless campaigner for Native American rights, he recommended the setting up of reservations and also began the recording of tribal oral histories. In 1881 Powell recruited Cyrus Thomas to settle the mound builder question once and for all. After 7 years of fieldwork and the investigation of thousands of mounds, Thomas proved that the mound builder race had never existed. The monuments had been erected by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. Times. Abbott, Putnam, and Wilson had been deceived into making false comparisons with the French stone tools by superficial similarities. Holmes' systematic methods also helped him to produce brilliant survey classifications of Aboriginal pottery of the eastern United States and study ruins in the Southwest and Mexico. He eventually succeeded Powell as head of the Bureau of American Ethnology. But his obsession with facts rather than theories made it difficult for him to accept the possibility that humans had after all reached North America in the Old Stone Age, as discoveries in the 1920s began to suggest. But that was not the only controversial issue confronting Powell's bureau. In 1876, a New Jersey physician, Charles Abbott, showed his collection of flaked stone tools to Harvard archaeologist Frederick Putnam, who thought they must be Paleolithic specimens, resembling as they did Stone Age tools found in France. The issue of the Paleoliths came to a head in 1887 when another archaeologist, Thomas Wilson, fresh from a period in France, embarked on a campaign to prove there had been Stone Age occupation of North America. William Henry Holmes. Holmes began his career as a geological illustrator, a training that stood him in good stead when he later turned to archaeology. At Powell's request he spent 5 years studying the Paleolith question. He collected innumerable specimens and proved that they were not Stone Age tools at all but simply the refuse of Indian implement making from recent 1.24 Putnam mistakenly compared prehistoric stone axes from France with Charles Abbott's paleoliths, which Holmes subsequently proved to be of recent date. Thus, well before the end of the 19th century, many of the principal features of modern archaeology had been established and many of the early civilizations had been discovered. There now ensued a period, which lasted until about 1960, which Gordon Wiley and Jeremy Sabloff in their A History of American Archaeology have described as the classificatory historical period. Its central concern, as they rightly characterize it, was chronology. Much effort went into the establishment of regional chronological systems and the description of the development of culture in each area. In regions where early civilizations had flourished, new research and discoveries filled out the chronological sequences. Alfred Maudslay laid the real scientific foundations of Maya archaeology, while the German scholar Max Euhl began to establish a sound chronology for Peruvian civilization with his excavation in the 1890s at the coastal site of Pachacamac, Peru. The meticulous work of Flinders Petrie in Egypt was followed up by the spectacular discovery in the 1920s of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter. In the Aegean area, Arthur Evans revealed a previously unknown civilization that he called Minoan on the island of Crete. The Minoans proved to be even earlier than Schliemann's Mycenaeans. And in Mesopotamia, Leonard Woolley excavated at Ur, the biblical city of Abraham's birth, and put the Sumerians on the map of the ancient world. It was, however, scholars studying primarily the prehistoric societies of Europe and North America who made that there were similar hieroglyphic inscriptions at the different sites, which led him to argue for Maya cultural unity. But no Champollion or Rawlinson was to emerge to decipher the glyphs until the 1960s. If the Bible was one of the main inspirations behind the search for lost civilizations in Egypt and the Near East, it was Homer's account of the Trojan Wars in his narrative poem The Iliad that fired the imagination of the German banker Heinrich Schliemann and sent him on a quest for the city of Troy. With remarkable luck and good judgment, he successfully identified it in a series of field campaigns at Hisarlik, western Turkey, in the 1870s and 1880s. Not content with that achievement, he then also dug at Mycenae in Greece and revealed, as at Troy, a hitherto unknown prehistoric civilization. Schliemann's methods of excavation have been criticized as crude and cavalier, but few were rigorous in his day, and he demonstrated how interpretation of the stratigraphy of a mound site could be used to reconstruct the remote past. Nevertheless, it fell to the next generation of archaeologists, led by General Pitt Rivers and William Flinders Petrie, to establish the true basis of modern field techniques. It is somewhat ironic that the piecemeal approach towards the investigation of the past in Europe was to be surpassed by the creation of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1862, funded by the Government of India because, in the words of Lord Canning, the Governor-General, it will not be to our credit as an enlightened ruling power if we continue to allow such fields of investigation to remain without more examination. In 1922, Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Survey, was to discover the last of the great Old World civilizations, that of the Indus. Such was the quality of his enormous excavations at both Bronze Age Mohenjo-Daro of the city were exposed, and historic Taxila that his reports are still used today for spatial reanalyses at these sites. Some of the most significant contributions during the first half of the 20th century. Gordon Childe, a brilliant Australian based in Britain, was the leading thinker and writer about European prehistory and Old World history in general. In the United States, there was a close link between anthropologists and archaeologists studying the Native Americans. The anthropologist Franz Boas reacted against the broad evolutionary schemes of his predecessors Morgan and Tyler and demanded much greater attention to the collection and classification of information in the field. Huge inventories of cultural traits, such as pot and basket designs or types of moccasins, were built up. This tied in with the so-called direct historical approach of the archaeologists, who attempted to trace modern Native American pottery and other styles directly back into the distant past. The work of Cyrus Thomas and later W. H. Holmes in the East was complemented by that of Alfred Kidder, whose excavations at Pecos Pueblo in the southwest from 1915 to 1929 established a chronological framework for that region. James A. Ford later developed the first major framework for the Southeast. By the 1930s, the number of separate regional sequences was so great that a group of scholars led by W. C. McKern devised what became known as the Midwestern Taxonomic System, which correlated sequences in the Midwest by identifying similarities between artifact collections. This was applied to other areas. Gordon Childe, meanwhile, had been making comparisons of this sort between prehistoric sequences in classification and consolidation. The development of field techniques. 1.26 Excavation in progress at War Barrow, Cranbourne Chase. The barrow was eventually removed. 1.27 A view of the War Barrow ditch during Pitt River's excavation at the site in the mid-1890s. 1.28 An example of Pitt River's meticulous records, his plan of Barrow 27 at Cranbourne Chase. 1.25 General Pitt Rivers. It was only in the late 19th century that a sound methodology of scientific excavation began to be generally adopted. From that time, and over the 20th century, major figures stand out who in their various ways helped to create modern field methods. General Augustus Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, for much of his life a professional soldier, Pitt Rivers brought long experience of military methods, survey, and precision to impeccably organized excavations on his estates in southern England. Plans, sections, and even models were made, and the exact position of every object was recorded. He was not concerned with retrieving beautiful treasures, but with recovering all objects, no matter how mundane. He was a pioneer in his insistence on total recording, and his 4 privately printed volumes, describing his excavations on Cranbourne Chase from 1887 to 1898, represent the highest standards of archaeological publication. In fact, his recording was so thorough that the site continues to be reinterpreted through these monographs today. Dorothy Garrod. In 1937, Dorothy Garrod became the first female professor in any subject at Cambridge, and probably the first female prehistorian to achieve professorial status anywhere in the world. Her excavations at Zartsi in Iraq and Mount Carmel in Palestine provided the key to a large section of the Near East, from the Middle Paleolithic to the Mesolithic, and found human remains crucial to our knowledge of the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. With her discovery of the Natufian culture, predecessor of the world's first farming societies, she posed a series of problems still not fully resolved today. Sir William Flinders Petrie. A younger contemporary of Pitt Rivers, Petrie was likewise noted for his meticulous excavations and his insistence on the collection and description of everything found, as well as on full publication. He employed these methods in his exemplary excavations in Egypt, and later in Palestine, from the 1880s until his death. Petrie also devised his own technique of seriation or sequence dating, which he used to bring chronological order to the 2,200 pit graves of the Naqada Cemetery in Upper Egypt. Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Wheeler fought in the British Army in both World Wars and, like Pitt Rivers, brought military precision to his excavations, notably through techniques such as the grid square method. He is particularly well known for his work at British Hill Forts, notably Maiden Castle. Equally outstanding, however, was his achievement from 1944 to 1948 as Director General of Archaeology in India, where he held training schools in modern field methods and excavated at the important sites of Harappa, Taxila, Charsada, and Archimedu, one of his most famous excavations. However, subsequent excavations at Maiden Castle, Archimedu, and 1.29 Flinders Petrie outside the tomb in which he lived in Giza, Egypt, in the 1880s. 1.30 31 Sir Mortimer Wheeler. His 1945 excavation at Archimedu. 1.32 Dorothy Garrod, one of the first to study the prehistoric Near East systematically. Charsada have inevitably caused many of his fundamental assumptions to be refuted. Julio Teo Teo, America's first indigenous archaeologist, was born and worked in Peru, began his career with studies in Peruvian linguistics, and qualified as a medical doctor before taking up anthropology. He did much to awaken an awareness of the archaeological heritage of Peru, and was the first to recognize the importance of the key site of Chavín de Huántar and indeed of such other major sites as Sequén Alto, Cerro Sequén, and Huari. He was one of the first to stress the autonomous rise of civilization in Peru, and he also founded the Peruvian National Museum of Archaeology. Alfred Kidder Kidder was the leading Americanist of his time. As well as being a major figure in Maya archaeology, he was largely responsible for putting the Southwest on the archaeological map with his excavations at Pecos Ruin, a large pueblo in northern New Mexico, from 1915 to 1929. His survey of the region, An Introduction to the Study of Southwestern Archaeology, has become a classic. Kidder was one of the first archaeologists to employ a team of specialists to analyze artifacts and human remains. He also developed a blueprint for a regional strategy. Reconnaissance, selection of criteria for ranking the remains of sites chronologically, seriation into a probable sequence, stratigraphic excavation to elucidate specific problems. Followed by more detailed regional survey and dating. Fieldwork after 1980. Since 1980, archaeological fieldwork has developed in several new directions. One of these is underwater archaeology, which began as a serious method of research in 1960 with the work of George Bass at the Bronze Age Gelidonia shipwreck off the south coast of Turkey. This was the first ancient vessel ever excavated in its entirety on the seabed. Bass and his team invented or developed many now standard underwater techniques. On dry land, the economic boom of the 1960s led to the construction of roads and buildings, which threatened and destroyed many archaeological sites and led to a new emphasis on managing the cultural heritage, either by preservation or by recording and excavation. Prior to destruction in Europe, the redevelopment of historic city centers led to highly complex excavations spanning many periods and demanding new analytical techniques. Finally, in recent years, the application of computerization in fieldwork has offered powerful new tools to help us recover and interpret the remains left by past societies. 1.33, 35 Julio Teo, arguably the greatest Native American social scientist of the 20th century, he was a Quechua Indian and the father of Peruvian archaeology. Alfred Kidder and his drawing of the stratigraphy at Pecos Pueblo. Architecture to metal weapons had spread or diffused to Europe from the Near East by trade or migration of people. With the much greater range of evidence available to him, Child modified this extreme diffusionist approach and argued that Europe had undergone some indigenous development, but he nevertheless attributed the major cultural changes to Near Eastern influences. In his later books, such as Man Makes Himself, Child went on to try and answer the much more difficult question, why had civilization arisen in the Near East? Himself influenced by Marxist ideas and the relatively recent Marxist revolution in Russia, he proposed that there had been a Neolithic revolution which gave rise to the development of farming, and later an urban revolution which led to the first towns and cities. Child was one of the few archaeologists of his generation bold enough to address this whole broad issue of why things happened or changed in the past. Most of his contemporaries were more concerned with establishing chronologies and cultural sequences. But after World War II, scholars with new ideas began to challenge conventional approaches. The ecological approach. One of the most influential new thinkers in North America was the anthropologist Julian Stewart. Like Child, he was interested in explaining cultural change, but he brought to the question an anthropologist's understanding of how living cultures work. Moreover, he highlighted the fact that cultures do not interact simply with one another but with the environment as well. The study of ways in which adaptation to the environment could cause cultural change Stewart christened cultural ecology. Perhaps the most direct archaeological impact of these ideas can be seen in the work of Gordon Wiley, one of Stewart's graduate associates, who carried out a pioneering investigation in the Viru Valley, Peru, in the late 1940s. This study of 1,500 years of pre-Columbian occupation involved a combination of observations from detailed maps and aerial photographs, survey at ground level, and excavation and surface potsherd collection to establish dates for the hundreds of prehistoric sites identified. Wiley then plotted the geographical distribution of these sites in the valley at different periods, one of the first settlement pattern studies in archaeology, and set them against the changing local environment. Quite independently of Stewart, however, the British archaeologist Graham Clark developed an ecological approach with even more direct relevance for archaeological fieldwork. Breaking away from the artifact-dominated culture-historical approach of his contemporaries, he argued that by studying how human 1.36 Professor Gordon Childe at the site of the Neolithic settlement at Skara Brae, Orkney, in 1930. Europe, almost single-handedly. Both his methods and the Midwestern taxonomic system were designed to order the material, to answer the question, to what period do these artifacts date? And also, with which other materials do they belong? This latter question usually carried with it an assumption which Gordon Childe made explicit: that a constantly recurring collection or assemblage of artifacts could be taken as the material equipment of a particular group of people. This approach thus offered the hope of answering, in a very general sense, the question, who did these artifacts belong to? The answer would be in terms of a named people, even if the name for a prehistoric people would be a modern one, not the original name. But in his great works of synthesis, such as The Dawn of European Civilization and The Danube in Prehistory, Childe went beyond merely describing and correlating the culture sequences and attempted to account for their origin. In the late 19th century, scholars such as Montelius had looked at the richness of the early civilizations then being uncovered in the Near East, and argued that all the attributes of civilization, from stone populations adapted to their environments, we can understand many aspects of ancient society. Collaboration with new kinds of specialists was essential. Specialists who could identify animal bones or plant remains in the archaeological record could help build up a picture not only of what prehistoric environments were like, but also what foods prehistoric peoples ate. Clark's landmark excavation at Starkar in northeast Britain in the early 1950s demonstrated just how much information could be gleaned from what appeared to be an unpromising site without stone structures, dating to just after the end of the Ice Age. Careful environmental analysis and recovery of organic remains showed that this had been a camp on the edge of a lake, where people had hunted red deer and eaten a wide variety of wild plant foods. The insights from an ecological approach need not be confined to individual sites or groups of sites. In a remarkable work of synthesis, Prehistoric Europe, The Economic Basis, Clark provided a panoramic view of the varying human adaptations to the European landscape over thousands of years. Out of this early ecological research has grown the whole field of environmental and dietary reconstruction discussed in chapters 6 and 7. The rise of archaeological science. The other striking development of the period immediately after World War II was the rapid development of scientific aids for archaeology. We have already seen how pioneers of the ecological approach forged an alliance with specialists from the environmental sciences. Even more important, however, was the application to archaeology of the physical and chemical sciences. The greatest breakthrough came in the field of dating. In 1949, the American chemist Willard Libby announced his invention of radiocarbon dating. It was not until well over a decade later that the full impact of this momentous technical achievement began to be felt. But the implications were clear. Here at last, archaeologists might have a means of directly determining the age of undated sites and finds anywhere in the world without recourse to complicated cross-cultural comparisons with areas already dated by historical methods. Thus, traditionally, prehistoric Europe had been dated by virtue of supposed contacts with early Greece and hence with ancient Egypt, which could itself be dated historically. The radiocarbon method now held the prospect of providing a completely independent chronology for ancient Europe. Chapter 4 discusses radiocarbon in detail, alongside dating methods in general. The growth in archaeological applications for scientific techniques was such that by 1963 a volume entitled Science and Archaeology, edited by Don Brothwell and Eric Higgs, could be published, which ran to nearly 600 pages, with contributions from 55 experts. Not merely on dating techniques and plant and animal studies, but methods for analyzing human remains and artifacts. Artifact studies, for instance, could contribute to an understanding of early trade. It proved possible to identify the raw materials of certain artifacts and the sources from which they had come through the technique of trace element analysis. As with many of the new methods, research in this field stretched back to the 1930s, when the Austrian archaeologist Richard Pidioni had begun to apply trace element analysis to early copper and bronze artifacts. Nevertheless, it was not until the post-war years that this and a number of other newly developed scientific techniques really began to make an impact on archaeology, and the increasing power of computers and software, for example, has made them indispensable for many aspects of data handling. Over recent decades, developments in biochemistry and molecular genetics have led to the emergence of the major disciplines of molecular archaeology and archaeogenetics. Sensitive techniques in the field of organic chemistry are beginning to allow the precise identification of organic residues, while isotopic studies are giving fresh insights into diet and nutrition. The study of DNA, both modern and ancient, has offered exciting and promising approaches to the study of human evolution, and is now also contributing to the study of plant and animal domestication on a systematic, molecular basis. 1.37 Gordon Wiley in a test pit at Barton Ramey during the Belize Valley Project studying Maya settlement patterns, 1953-60. Among the pioneers of petrographic analysis, published extensively on the technology of New World pottery, and wrote a standard work, Ceramics for the Archaeologist. She carried out most of her work in a laboratory at home in relative isolation, rarely going into the field, but nevertheless carved out a unique niche for herself in the profession. Kathleen Kenyon, a formidable British archaeologist, daughter of a director of the British Museum, Kenyon trained on Roman sites in Britain under Mortimer Wheeler and adopted his method. She subsequently applied this approach in the Near East at two of the most complex and most excavated sites in Palestine, Jericho and Jerusalem. At Jericho, in 1952-1958, she found evidence that pushed back the date of occupation to the end of the Ice Age, and uncovered the walled village of the Neolithic farming community, commonly referred to as the earliest town in the world. 1.39 Gertrude Cotton Thompson. Her work at Great Zimbabwe confirmed that the site was the work of a major African culture. 1.40 Anna O. Shepard was an acknowledged expert in the ceramics of the American Southwest and Mesoamerica. Pioneering women in archaeology. The story of many early female archaeologists was one of exclusion and lack of recognition or promotion, or even employment. Furthermore, many brilliant academic women accepted that, after marriage, their career would no longer be a professional one, and supported the academic work of their husband with little public recognition. This has remained so until the present time, so the achievements of the following pioneers stand out all the more. Lavishly illustrated report that is still consulted today. It is noteworthy for its classification of artifacts according to potential function, drawing on ethnographic parallels from Cretan rural life of the time. Gertrude Cotton Thompson. A wealthy British researcher who followed courses in prehistory and anthropology at Cambridge, Cotton Thompson subsequently became known for her pioneering interdisciplinary projects of survey and excavation in the Fayum of Egypt and later, perhaps most famously, at Great Zimbabwe, where her excavations in 1929 unearthed datable artifacts from a stratified context and confirmed that the site represented a major culture of African origin. The violent reaction from the white community in Rhodesia to her findings so upset her that she refused to undertake further work in southern Africa, returning to Egypt and Arabia. Anna O. Shepard, an American who studied a wide range of hard sciences, Shepard subsequently became a specialist in Mesoamerican and Southwestern archaeology and ceramics. She was 1.38 Harriet Boyd Hawes, discoverer of the Minoan town site of Gurnia, Crete. Harriet Boyd Hawes, this well-educated American, majored in classics and was fluent in Greek. Just after graduating, she spent several seasons riding around Crete on muleback, in dangerous territory, alone or in the company of another woman, looking for prehistoric sites. In 1901 she discovered the Bronze Age site of Gurnia, the first Minoan town site ever unearthed, which she excavated for the next 3 years, supervising 100 local workmen. She published her findings in exemplary fashion in A. Tatiana Proskuryakov. Born in Siberia, Proskuryakov moved with her family to Pennsylvania in 1916. Unemployed after graduating as an architect during the Great Depression, she ended up working as a museum artist in the University of Pennsylvania. A visit to the Maya site of Piedras Negras led her to devote the rest of her life to Maya architecture, art, and hieroglyphs. A skilled artist, she produced numerous plans of the architecture of Chichen Itza and Copan, and a definitive book entitled A Study of Classic Maya Sculpture. She also worked alone till her death on the complex problems of Maya hieroglyphic writing, challenging the theory that the inscriptions contained only calendrical and astronomical information and putting forward the pioneering notion that the Maya were also recording their political and dynastic histories. Work that contributed to the breakthrough in the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs. Mary Leakey, a cigar-smoking, whiskey-drinking British archaeologist who, together with her husband Lewis, transformed their chosen field. They worked for almost half a century at many sites in East Africa, carrying out meticulous excavations, most notably at Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, where in 1959 Mary unearthed the skull of an adult Australopithecine, Zinjanthropus boisei, of 1.79 million years ago, and at Litoli, where she excavated the famous trails of fossilized hominin footprints, made 3.7 million years ago. She also painstakingly recorded a large amount of Tanzanian rock art. A splendid insight into the careers and personalities of women as well as male archaeologists in Greece in the early years of the 20th century is given in Faces of Archaeology in Greece, with a wonderful series of portrait caricatures by Pete de Jong, chief illustrator for Sir Arthur Evans at his excavations at Knossos in Crete. Among the well-known archaeologists are Winifred Lamb, excavator of Thermae in Lesbos, Hetty Goldman, excavator of early Bronze Age Utresis, and Virginia Grace, a world authority on the Roman amphora trade. None of these married, but it is clear that the women scholars who did marry, thus ending their professional careers, such as Vivian Wade Jerry or Josephine Shear, were just as brilliant academically. 1.44 Mary Leakey worked at various early hominin sites in East Africa, transforming our knowledge of human development. 1.41 43 Kathleen Kenyon was a great excavator, working at two of the most important and complex sites in the Near East, Jericho and Jerusalem. Tatiana Proskuryakov trained as an architect and worked originally as a museum artist. Her reconstruction of the Maya Palace at Spuel, her work on Maya glyphs contribute greatly to their final decipherment. 1.45 46 Virginia Grace and Hetty Goldman as depicted by Pete de Jong. They had long and very distinguished careers in archaeology. The 1960s marked a turning point in the development of archaeology. By this time various dissatisfactions were being expressed with the way research in the subject was conducted. These dissatisfactions were not so much with excavation techniques, or with the newly developed scientific aids, but with the way conclusions were drawn from them. The first and most obvious point concerned the role of dating. The second went beyond this. It focused on the way archaeologists explain things, on the procedures used in archaeological reasoning. With the advent of radiocarbon dating, dates could in many cases be assigned rapidly, and without the long and laborious framework of cross-cultural comparisons needed previously. To establish a date was no longer one of the main end products of research. It was still important, but it could now be done much more efficiently, allowing the archaeologist to go on to ask more challenging questions than merely chronological ones. The second and more fundamental cause for dissatisfaction with traditional archaeology was that it never seemed to explain anything other than in terms of migrations of peoples and supposed influences. Already in 1948, the American archaeologist Walter W. Taylor had formulated some of these dissatisfactions in his A Study of Archaeology. He had argued for a conjunctive approach in which the full range of a culture system would be taken into consideration. And in 1958, Gordon Wiley and Philip Phillips in their Method and Theory in American Archaeology had argued for a greater emphasis on the social aspect, for a broader processual interpretation or study of the general processes at work in culture history. They also spoke of an eventual synthesis in a common search for socio-cultural causality and law. That was all very well, but what would it mean in practice? The birth of the new archaeology. In the United States, the answer was provided, at least in part, by a group of younger archaeologists, led by Louis Binford, who set out to offer a new approach to the problems of archaeological interpretation, which was soon dubbed by its critics and then by its supporters the New Archaeology. In a series of articles, and later in an edited volume, New Perspectives in Archaeology, Binford and his colleagues argued against the approach that tried to use archaeological data to write a kind of counterfeit history. They maintained that the potential of the archaeological evidence was much greater than had been realized for the investigation of social and economic aspects of past societies. Their view of archaeology was more optimistic than that of many of their predecessors. They also argued that archaeological reasoning should be made explicit. Conclusions should be based not simply on the personal authority of the scholar making the interpretation, but on an explicit framework of logical argument. In this they relied on current ideas within the philosophy of science, where conclusions, if they are to be considered valid, must be open to testing. Within the spirit of processual archaeology advocated by Wiley and Phillips, they sought to explain rather than simply to describe, and to do so, as in all sciences, by seeking to make valid generalizations. In doing this they sought to avoid the rather vague talk of the influences of one culture upon another, but rather to analyze a culture as a system which could be broken down into subsystems. This led them to study subsistence in its own right, and technology, and the social subsystem, and the ideological subsystem, and trade and demography, and so forth, with much less emphasis on artifact typology and classification. In this way they had been partly anticipated by the ecological approach of the 1950s, which was 1.47 Louis Binford, the founder of the New Archaeology, lecturing on his work among the Nunamiut hunters of Alaska. A turning point in archaeology. In the early days of the New Archaeology, its principal exponents were very conscious of the limitations of the older, traditional archaeology. The following contrasts were among those which they often emphasized. The nature of archaeology, explanatory versus descriptive. Archaeology's role was now to explain past change, not simply to reconstruct the past and how people had lived. This involved the use of explicit theory. Explanation, culture process versus culture history. Traditional archaeology was seen to rely on historical explanation. The New Archaeology, drawing on the philosophy of science, would think in terms of culture process, of how changes in economic and social systems take place. This implies generalization. Reasoning, deductive versus inductive. Traditional archaeologists saw archaeology as resembling a jigsaw puzzle. The task was piecing together the past. Instead, the appropriate procedure was now seen as formulating hypotheses, constructing models, and deducing their consequences. Validation, testing versus authority. Hypotheses were to be tested, and conclusions should not be accepted on the basis of the authority or standing of the research worker. Research focus. Project design versus data accumulation. Research should be designed to answer specific questions economically, not simply to generate more information which might not be relevant. Choice of approach, quantitative versus simply qualitative. The benefits were seen of quantitative data, allowing computerized statistical treatment, with the possibility of sampling and significance testing. This was often preferred to the purely verbal traditional approach. Scope, optimism versus pessimism. Traditional archaeologists stressed that archaeological data were not well suited to the reconstruction of social organization or cognitive systems. The new archaeologists argued that one would never know how hard these problems were until one tried to solve them. Already studying what one might call the subsistence subsystem in very much these terms. In order to fulfill these aims, the new archaeologists to a large extent turned away from the approaches of history towards those of the sciences. Very similar developments were underway in Britain at the same time, exemplified by the work of David L. Clarke, particularly in his book Analytical Archaeology, which reflected the great willingness of the new archaeologists to employ more sophisticated quantitative techniques, computer-aided where possible, and to draw on ideas from other disciplines, notably geography. It must be admitted that in their enthusiasm to seize on and utilize a battery of new techniques, the new archaeologists drew also on a range of previously unfamiliar vocabularies, which their critics tended to dismiss as jargon. Indeed, in recent years, several critics have reacted against some of those aspirations to be scientific, which they have categorized as scientistic or functionalist. Much of the emphasis of early processual archaeology was indeed upon functional or ecological explanation, and it is now possible to regard its first decade as representing a functional processual phase, which has been followed in recent years by a cognitive processual phase, which seeks more actively to include the consideration of symbolic and cognitive aspects of early societies into the program of research. Many of these points are considered in Chapter 12. But there can be no doubt that archaeology will never be the same again. Most workers today, even the critics of the early new archaeology, implicitly recognize its influence when they agree that it is indeed the goal of archaeology to explain what happened in the past as well as to describe it. Most of them agree too that in order to do good archaeology it is necessary to make explicit, and then to examine, our underlying assumptions. That was what David Clarke meant when he wrote in a 1973 article of The Loss of Innocence in Archaeology. Processual archaeology. The questioning approach of the new archaeology and the demand for explicit and quantitative procedures led to new developments in field research, many of which built on or coincided with the programs of fieldwork already being conducted by archaeologists who would not necessarily have thought of themselves as followers of the new school of thought. In the first place, there was a much greater emphasis on field projects with well-defined research objectives projects. World archaeology, which set out to answer specific questions about the past. Secondly, the new insights yielded by the ecological approach made it clear that satisfactory answers to many major questions would only be forthcoming if whole regions and their environments were studied, rather than single sites in isolation. And the third development, very much linked to the first and second, was the realization that in order to carry out these objectives effectively, new techniques needed to be introduced of intensive field survey and selective excavation, coupled with statistically based sampling procedures and improved recovery methods, including screening of excavated material. These are the key elements of modern field research, discussed in detail in Chapter 3. Their widespread application began to create for the first time a truly global discipline, an archaeology with worldwide reach, and an archaeology that reaches back in time to the beginnings of human existence and right up to the modern period. The search for origins. Among the pioneers of well-focused project design was Robert J. Braidwood, of the University of Chicago, whose multidisciplinary team in the 1940s and 1950s systematically sought out sites in the Iraqi Kurdistan region that would provide evidence for the origins of agriculture in the Near East. Another American project, headed by Richard McNeish, did the same for the New World. Their research in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico moved our understanding of the gradual development of maize farming an immense step forward. If the origins of farming have been the subject of much well-targeted research in recent decades, the rise of complex societies, including civilizations, has been another. In particular, 2 American field projects have been outstandingly successful, one in Mesopotamia led by Robert Adams, and the other in the Valley of Oaxaca, Mexico, led by Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus. However, the credit for the most determined pursuit of a project with a clear archaeological objective in the whole history of archaeology should perhaps go to Louis Leakey and Mary Leakey, who between them pushed back the known dates for our immediate ancestors by several million years. As long ago as 1931 they began their search in the Olduvai Gorge, East Africa, for fossil human bones, but it was not until 1959 that their extraordinary perseverance was rewarded and Mary Leakey made the first of many fossil hominin finds in the gorge. Africa has now become the great focus of study for the early phases of humankind and has seen crucial theoretical debate between Louis Binford, C.K. Brain, Glenn Isaac, and others over the likely hunting and scavenging behavior of our early ancestors. The archaeology